Welcome, everyone. My name is Kiran Karande, and I'm the Associate Dean in the Strome College of Business. And welcome to the Strome Insights webinars of today. Today's presenter is Arndt, and the title of his presentation is Achieving Your Objectives During Negotiations. We look forward to his giving us some practical tips on closing of negotiations, how to handle objections and how to make concessions. Arndt is an associate. Before that, this is the second of a two-part series of webinars. The first one he presented last year, and we sent a link for this along with the registration. Hopefully, some of you have looked at it. Some of you all have even attended his first webinar. If not, you can always go back and have a look. So as I said, the title of his presentation today is Achieving Your Objectives During Negotiations. A little bit about Arndt. Arndt is a professor of marketing here at Strome. He's also the chair of the Thurman School of Professional Sales and Negotiations. Now, this is a center this is a school that offers top-notch soft skills training to our students, to our faculty, and to the local community. Arndt is a top-notch researcher. He's published in the best of journals in marketing and retailing, and he has won numerous awards for his research and teaching. He's regularly quoted in the media, and his research is quoted in the media. You might have seen him heard him on NPR, or seen him in the Virginian Pilot. So that's about Arndt and a little bit about today's presentation. Arndt, this is all yours now.
All right, thank you very much, Kiran. Okay, so as Kiran mentioned, this is the second part of the series. We're going to talk a little bit more about the actual process of negotiating, so when you're actually in a negotiating room. So this was brought together through a combination of both practitioner literature and academic literature. So some of this has been researched thoroughly, and some of this comes from more of a practitioner base. So when something is particularly been researched, I'll mention that. So we're going to start by talking about negotiation power and how to use it. In the first presentation, we spent a lot of time talking about presentation power. And this time, I'm going to put a bunch of caveats onto it. So just as a reminder of what negotiating power is, power gets you what you want, basically. It helps you achieve your objectives. It's important for both the competitive and collaborative negotiations. So what I mean by that is even when you're collaborating and getting what you want, is a softer kind of process, having power can still help you. Even in that process can give you a little bit more leverage. It can even get you into more of a collaborative negotiation in the first place. So one key source of power that we talked a lot about in the first presentation is the option to walk away first. The person who can walk away first is often the one who has the more power, right? Because they have more options. They can say, nope, I don't want to do this negotiation. See you later. And that gives them a lot of power to set the tone of the negotiation. And this comes from this term, best alternative to negotiation agreement. This originated in the area of legal negotiations, but it has been applied and tested and researched in a variety of different settings, particularly organizational settings. And it has been shown that it does give a lot of power. And what it is, it's your best option outside of the negotiation. Think of this, the simplest way of saying this is your plan B. So if things don't work out, what is your other option? What is your next best thing, your contingency plan? This is not how you negotiate during the process or anything like, what you're going to offer during the negotiation. This is negotiation falls apart or you decide not to negotiate at all. What else do you have? And what this sets is your walkaway point. If you can't get as good from your negotiation as you'd get from your plan B, then why are you negotiating in the first place, right? So how BATNA works, think about it like this. So imagine that you've got a manufacturer who's selling widgets. The cost to make and sell widgets is $5. The customer could pay up to $10 per widget. So as a simple BATNA, now coming up with your list of BATNAs or your list of alternatives, it takes some time and is a little bit of a complicated process. But the one that you like the most, your best alternative, the one that, and it's of course preference, so it can depend on the situation. But your BATNA is your favorite plan B. So in this case, I've selected BATNA don't sell widgets for the manufacturer. So if they're not able to make, to sell it for at least $5, don't make it, don't sell it. Customer, they can afford to pay up to $10 per widget. Their BATNA, don't buy the widget. And what this does is this gives us a zone of possible agreement, which is the acronym is ZOPA. So the manufacturer can sell it for as low as $5. The customer can buy it for as high as $10, which means that you could negotiate anywhere in between there. So maybe $7.50 if you were going to do a 50-50 split in between. Now imagine for a second that the customer finds another seller of widgets, and that seller is offering an equivalent widget for $8. So now the customer's BATNA, I'm going to cross that out over here, don't buy the widget, and instead buy the widget for $8. So now the zone of possible agreement has shrunk, right? Because the customer can say, well, I'm not going to pay $10. That's ridiculous. I can go somewhere else and pay $8. So BATNA can then, you see that the customer and manufacturer BATNA sets the zone of possible agreement. Now, there's a little bit of an extra layer to this, right? Because the customer doesn't necessarily know the manufacturer's BATNA, and the manufacturer doesn't really know the customer's BATNA a lot of times. So there's more to this, of course, and refer to my part 1. But in general, this is what the academic literature has found, is that BATNA is really important for setting the zone of possible agreement. Now, going to practitioner literature, exercising your BATNA is not always possible. Let's say that you're in the process of negotiating, and something else comes up, your BATNA changes. You find that you have another alternative you hadn't thought of, and this is a really great alternative. You'd love to be able to exercise that. The problem is that at some point, walking away from the deal after a certain threshold is restricted in certain legal systems. So in the United States, generally not. Generally, you can walk away until the final deal is signed. But even in the US, there are things like letters of intent or equivalent that kind of lock you into a deal. And so they may have a restriction for backing out. And I'll give you an example. So this is an example between SIGA and Pharmathene. SIGA is a small company, and it was developing a smallpox treatment. They negotiated a licensing agreement with Pharmathene in exchange for loans because they were just too small to be able to take this to market. They had the idea, but they needed to be able to develop it. They went to Pharmathene and they got a loan. And unfortunately for SIGA, they were very weak in this particular bargaining. Pharmathene was big, they were small, and the deal that they got, they were not satisfied with. But partway through the development phase, they ended up getting a grant funding, actually, a fairly substantive amount of grant funding, and they no longer needed this Pharmathene loan. And they said, well, we'll just return the money, and then when we take this to market, we won't have to pay Pharmathene this relatively huge amount of money. So with this stronger BATNA, SIGA tried to renegotiate the licensing agreement that was going to occur afterwards. So return the money, deals off. But Pharmathene said, hey, you got pretty far into this deal and you tried to negotiate and back out. And so they sued and successfully sued for $113 million. So after a certain period, you can't always back out. So BATNA is really important. It's really, really important. But you can't always exercise it. So the key takeaway is know when you can and can't exercise it. Also, there's another piece to this, of course, which is what sets that price inside the ZOPA, right? What sets the price, between the $5 and the $8? Well, the answer to that is that there's other sources of power as well. Expert power, which is how much knowledge each party contributes. So having knowledge can give you a ton of power, right? Insider scoop kind of thing. Referent power is, I've seen a variety of different definitions of this, but ultimately think of this as ability to inspire or persuade. One key source of this might be your sales skills, so how good a salesperson you are. Referent power. So this is an ability to contribute in terms of usually monetarily or provide some sort of additional tangible incentive. Coercive power, sort of the opposite, but it's also threats. So for example, the ability to offer a lawsuit or take somebody to court. And then finally, legitimate power, rank, and authority. And in my first presentation, we talked a lot about how rank and authority is not always a source of power. In fact, somebody in a weaker position can actually have a lot more negotiating power situationally. But sometimes, of course, if you're the boss, you can order people to do what you need them to do. So legitimate power can have a lot of sway in certain situations. So if we were to take this to our situation of selling widgets, so BATNA versus these sources of structural power. So expert power, an example might be the manufacturer is really good at forecasting. So they have this expertise and they know things and they know just a whole lot more about the market. And that's a valuable thing that is needed by the customer. So the customer would then be less able, or would accept a higher price. As an example. Referent power. The manufacturer maybe has sales skills, negotiating skills to be able to improve their what they receive. Reward power. The manufacturer could potentially offer a shipping discount. Okay. Coercive power. The manufacturer threatens to increase the price in the future. This is one of those, if you don't buy today, it's a scarcity thing. If you don't buy it today, it'll get more expensive in the future. So it's kind of a threat. And in this particular situation, there may not be any legitimate power. So it doesn't really necessarily apply in this particular situation. Okay, so related to our first point, key takeaways. If you have a weak BATNA, strengthen it in the long term and cultivate other sources of power. Takeaway 2, use your BATNA to decide when to negotiate and your walkaway points, but use other forms of power to pin down that final agreement. Don't forget about them. And lastly, know when you can legally exercise your BATNA. Okay, let's go ahead and get into styles. And we also covered this a little bit in the first presentation as well. So just as a recap, there are 5 general negotiating styles that are identified, particularly in the practitioner literature. These competing styles, collaborative, avoiding, compromise, and accommodating. And I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I've put pictures up to kind of portray these. So the competing style is, I take from you, you give to me, I give you nothing in return. This is a one-way thing. I'm going to demand from you, and I am not willing to give any concessions in return. Meanwhile, a compromise style is the idea that I'll give a little bit, you give a little bit. We'll meet in the middle somewhere. Maybe not the exact center, but we're going to negotiate. This is haggling. And this is when people think negotiating, they tend to think of this. The literature also identifies a lot about collaboration. And that's the idea of working together to find big picture solutions where everybody can win. Collaboration works great when it works. It's the idea that you can grow the pie together. There's a lot of complexities to when you want to use collaboration. The key problem, of course, is trust, because you don't necessarily want to collaborate with somebody you don't trust. If they could use that growing the pie to then, well, I don't know, crush you and take more, or you think you're collaborating, they think they're using the compete style and you're accommodating, and you end up losing a lot. So collaborate with only those who you really, really trust. Then there's the accommodating style, which is the idea that I'm going to give you something and I'm not going to ask for anything in return. Now, why might I want to use a style like this? Well, the answer is if I made a mistake and I need to rebuild trust, or I need to rebuild relationship. This is the idea of a service failure. and I need to come in and step in and make things right with the customer. And finally, the avoiding style is the idea that we're not going to go negotiate at all right now. We're going to wait. And sometimes the avoiding style is the best style, right? Because let's say that you have a better BATNA than you could get from negotiating. Well, why are you negotiating? But if only one party has that and the other party doesn't, maybe the best thing to do is to avoid the negotiation altogether. The other thing is the avoiding style. Let's say that there's going to be a lot of contention, a lot of maybe a lot of anxiety, maybe a lot of yelling, and just waiting a little bit for people to calm down, maybe waiting a few days for tempers to come down a notch. The avoiding style can help with that as well. And then also in a minute, we're going to talk about deadlines. Avoiding can also help you to run out the clock, so to speak. So all of these styles can be useful at some point. And I'm going to go through some examples. So which style works well, and why? Well, let's say that you have a teamwork with a trusted colleague. So it's teamwork. You win together, you lose together. Well, if it were me, I would consider collaborating, right? Because you're going to have to share information with them anyways. It's teamwork. It's a trusted colleague as opposed to an untrustworthy one. So you can work together to grow the pie, so to speak. You made a mistake and you need to fix that mistake. This one would be an accommodate. I would use an accommodate here because you're trying to repair whatever relationship damage that you caused through your mistake. You need to take action in a life-threatening emergency, and let's say you're working as in a city role. You you have some sort of important role where people's lives are at stake, and the residents of this particular, let's say, area, their safety is a key concern, and a resident starts arguing with you. Well, in this case, the one thing about the compete style is it's very, very quick. It's not great for building relationships, as you can imagine. It really burns relationships. But if you need to get something done really, really fast, that might be the right style. And so the compete style is a good one for that. So here you might want to use a compete style where you basically say, look, I don't have time to argue about this. Our lives are at stake. And so you might use this particular style there. Let's say a taxpayer in default would like a payment plan to pay off their taxes as soon as possible. Well, this could be a compromise style where you're negotiating to try and figure out what kind of payment plan is going to work out. And finally, a resident who you do not need to speak to is calling you just to vent. Well, you're not going to get a lot out of that, so I would recommend avoiding that one. Now, you can pair these styles with negotiating process. Now, negotiating process is the idea of the rules that surround a negotiation. These rules can be all kinds of things, like what constitutes a formal agreement? What does a formal agreement look like? Who is going to attend the negotiation? What are the conditions of the negotiation in terms of like just where is it going to take place? Is there going to be food and beverages? Are there going to be breaks? How long is it? What kind of deadlines do you have? All these kind of things go into the idea of process. And you compare style with process in order to give yourself an advantage. And the big one that I already mentioned before is avoidance plus deadlines. You can run out the clock. And deadlines are often used as a strategic tool in negotiations. You'll notice in big high-profile government negotiations, they usually wait until the very last minute to be able to iron out these big negotiations. That is very much intentional, right? It's the idea of who's willing to blink first. And particularly if one group has a more pressing need to meet the deadline first, they're at a disadvantage. So the negotiator with a shorter deadline is at the disadvantage because they need to get things done. So the other party can take advantage of that. If they negotiate things well in advance, then that deadline no longer provides that advantage. So you can use the avoidance technique to basically wait until the last minute to give yourself that advantage if the other party has the shorter deadline. Negotiation style plus technology. right? So this could be where you negotiate. So the thing is, if you negotiate online, there are some disadvantages. So there's all kinds of online options, right? You could negotiate by text message even, right? But the farther you go online, the fewer context cues you lose, the more nonverbals you lose, the harder it is to communicate, right? So if you're face to face, you just simply have a lot more cues that you can go off of, nonverbal, paralinguistic, which is like your voice fluctuation, things like that. And particularly if you're in a quiet environment where you can hear everything and you can have a nice communicating environment, that is ideal for communications generally. And the farther you get into things like email and text message, the harder it is to read the other person and understand what they mean. So if somebody types in all cap locks, does that mean that they're yelling, or does it mean that they just have their cap locks on, right? So it's harder to tell what people are thinking over online. It's harder to have that. But that can actually be an advantage too. If you need space to think, use technology with built-in pauses. So I had a colleague who was very, very good at negotiating and gave me a lot of advice about negotiating over the years. And he told me that the negotiations that he tended to lose were when he would be walking down the hallway and someone would come up to him and start talking to him. And he was a nice guy and he tended to want to say yes to things. And then they would come back later and say, well, you said yes to, this, X, Y, and Z. And then that would potentially get him in trouble. So what he learned is that when somebody would come up to him and say, hey, what do you think of X, Y, and Z proposal? He'd say, well, shoot me an email and we'll set up a time and we'll discuss it. The idea is that instead of making that decision right there in the moment, he was kicking it into a position where he could think about it. It would give him time to think. And that was, of course, is really important with negotiating. Preparation time is key. So if you need time to think, you can use technology with built-in pauses like email to be able to slow that process down and give you more time to plan. And technology, of course, is really well suited to using the avoidance style. If you want to run out the clock, email is perfect. The other thing too, let's say that you're going to negotiate with someone who is, they like to yell. They're one of those people who's going to use a compete style, and maybe they're very aggressive, and that makes you feel very uncomfortable. Then with that person, if nothing else, just to give yourself the comfort of working with that person or having to negotiate with that person, you might want to put yourself online and suggest Zoom meetings or meetings where it's harder for them to be aggressive. The last thing too is, particularly if somebody's really, really angry and upset, as I mentioned before, taking that time, that pause button to be able to let the tempers cool is often very important. Okay, addressing objectives. Objections. Sometimes it's not just what you say, but how you say it, right? So if you address objections in a way that makes people feel badly, if they raise some sort of concern and you shoot them down, it can make them feel worse. But it can also be an opportunity for you to be able to hash out differences with people. In the sales literature, we've looked at this and shown that how you address objections can really lead you to actually building trust and satisfying customer needs even better than you would have had the customer not had needs in the first place or not had objections in the first place. So what you want to do is you want to let people save face and feel as respected as possible. So I'm going to give you some examples, some bad examples and some good examples, just as a compare and contrast. So how would you feel if you had each of these statements? So you say something and the other person says, no, that's completely wrong. You probably would go, whoa, hold on a second. And it would probably make you want to get defensive. Now, in the second one, I can see why you would think that, but actually that is not correct. In the sales literature, this is what we'd call an indirect denial. And the nice thing about this is that it helps you to let them save face, right? It gives you a chance to let them save face. So I can see why you'd think that. You're not stupid for thinking that. And then you correct them. It's the idea that that you're telling them that you're validating their opinion. This next one, come on, you should have looked this up beforehand. Again, very adversarial, and you're going to put them on the defensive. You don't actually believe that, do you? Again, very defensive. Now, going back to, you're on the right track, but there are a few additional things you should know. Again, validates their basic belief. And of course, this last one, don't be an idiot. Obviously, you don't want to do that. And then, by comparison, that might have been true before, but now. So when you correct people with this indirect idea, you are validating the person's feelings before correcting them. So this should be your go-to verbal technique. Just generally, when you need to correct someone, don't immediately go, no, that's not right. Try and find some way to validate what they said, if at all possible. I mean, this is true for me even in the classroom, right? So if a student raises their hand and says something and it's not right, I don't want them to feel bad, because then they'll never raise their hand in class again, right? So I try to validate them in some way. I'm like, I could definitely see why you feel that way, or I could definitely, that's a really interesting opinion. It's not the one I was thinking of, but that's a really interesting idea, with the idea of giving them that validation. That said, particularly in a professional context, you don't want to accidentally agree to something that could be used against you, for example, in a lawsuit. So you have to be very careful with how you validate. So it has to be like feelings, or I can see why you'd think that, but you can't actually agree. If you said like that used to be true in the past, but it wasn't, then that could have been true in the past. Well, I think that might have been true, but it was true. You have to be careful, right? If you could also use the gentle denial. And this is the go-to for less important corrections. If the person is insulting you, or any agreement with the person would put you in legal jeopardy. So this can also be a technique that's used. We've found in our research that it does tend to miss an opportunity when to build up trust with the customer, but it can work. It is sometimes the right option. All right, what happens if a person has a point but is discounting your point? There's two different techniques you can use for this. One is compensating, to remind them of what they said earlier. You're right that money is going to be tight for a while, but earlier you said you wanted to pay off your taxes, and this is a plan to accomplish that goal. Also, let's see, didn't you say earlier that you wanted to pay off your taxes? And then you puts the ball back in their court to answer that question. I'm reading a question out here. So this was a question. Has there been any research about using AI-generated or other methodology image during a Zoom negotiation to maximize the effect of negotiating style or source of negotiating power? And the answer to that is, if there has, then I don't know about it. So I'm not actually sure the answer to that question. It is a very interesting question, and I will look at that in the future, but I'm actually not sure. Okay, so sometimes you can't negotiate, can't get any forward process because there's anger, and there's like people, people's hackles are raised, and you're getting into arguments basically. So when the other party is upset, the idea is to get what you want still, right? Don't get mad, don't get even. You try and take all that aside and say, what is going to accomplish the goal that I'm trying to accomplish? So the main thing is to stay in control and don't lose sight of your objectives. There's been a very large number of techniques that have been looked at. But one of the techniques that seems to work pretty well is projecting a sense of calm. So it's the idea of modeling desired behaviors. And it goes with this idea of emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is the idea that if one person's emotions may spread to the other. And when somebody's being angry and really like yelling, emotional contagion can infect you and make you angrier, right? So your defense may be to get angrier. Well, So one, or at least there's been a few different research studies that have shown that not doing that can be helpful, right? Maintaining more of a neutral type approach and not going with the raising your hackles, so to speak. So another thing is to convey that the person's being listened to and taken seriously. So even if they're angry, you go back to that personal thing where you're trying to build that trust and maintain the trust and say, look, I understand you're really angry. I might be angry in your shoes as well. Let's go ahead and help you take care of your whatever issue that you've got, and then we can move on from there. So you're trying to de-escalate, because while they're in that very heightened emotional state, you're just not going to get anything done, or you're not going to have effective negotiations. You've got to take them down out of it. So projecting that sense of calm. By the way, when I started using this with my children, it's really worked. I sometimes when my kids would throw a temper tantrum, it'd be like, oh, well, you're in timeout, and kind of try and be like, hey, that's not right. But when I tried to very calmly say, no, please stop doing that. You're going to eventually, and I'll get named some sort of consequence. It really seemed to work. So I've used this in my personal life too. But there are times that nothing is going to seem to work. When nothing seems to work, find a reason to meet at a later time. The key here is don't reference their current emotional state, right? So if they are currently angry, and you say, you're too angry to meet right now, all that's going to do is make them angrier. So try to find some reason to meet at a later time. So, hey, I don't have all the information we need, so let's meet at a later time. That gives them a time to calm down, hopefully. So the key takeaways. One is that no single negotiation style is going to work for every situation. People tend to have a default style that is just their favorite style, and that's what they like. But try to try to use them all, basically know when to use them all and be proficient with all of them. The other thing is, it's not just what you say, but how you say it. Even the compete style, where it's a very aggressive style, you can still be nice when you say things. So like, hey, I'm not going to do it that way, but you don't necessarily have to yell, right? So even within the styles, just how you say things can also affect what kind of outcomes you get. All right. I realize I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'll go a little faster. So also getting a good deal is the next thing we're going to cover. So this is all about zero-sum price negotiations. Zero-sum means it's called distributive. It's the idea that you have a certain amount of pie, and you're not going to grow that pie. It's how much pie you get, right? So you get to split it 50-50, or are you going to get 60%? So if you both make equal concessions, you're going to get a 50-50 split. If you make fewer concessions, you're going to receive more of the pie, so you're going to get a better price. But the key to this is always you have to play the game, or else you're going to deadlock. And the idea of the terminology deadlock means that the negotiation stops, and you have to exercise your bad. Now you're playing B and walk away, basically, or wait for the other person to change their mind and start negotiating again. So here's this beautiful painting, which I used AI to generate, actually. I typed in professor riding a cow, and that's what came up. So here, this beautiful painting is for sale. So imagine that an artist is selling this painting here to a buyer. The asking price that the artist asks is $1,000. The buyer suggests $500. If you make equal moves, so here, if you look at your initial positions, the seller offers $1,000, the buyer offers $500. The seller offers $100 concession, and the buyer offers an equal concession. You can see that they just basically move until they reach a midpoint and a 50-50 split. But what happens if the buyer is a little bit more reluctant, right? So you've got a seller offers a $100 concession, but the buyer says, I'm not going to make any concession. Well, now what happens is, because the seller is already offered for $900, now the buyer is at a strategic advantage, right? They've already knocked $100 off. The only thing is that so whoever moves first is moving first is risky, right? Because you risk that the other person is going to say no, and then you're in a worse negotiating position. So if possible, you don't want to make the first move. You want to wait till the other person makes the first move. But you do have to move. I can't tell you how many student negotiations I witnessed where one party says no, the other party says no, and then that's it. It's a short negotiation where everybody just walks away. If you do have to move at some point. So if the person says, move, 100, the other person refuses, and the other person says, well, okay, but maybe we can make a $50 concession, and the other person moves. So even though it's a smaller concession, you at least start the process back up. So if possible, you wait a little bit to move. So you try and hold tough on that first number for a little while, and then you start moving. If you make a smaller concession than the other party, what can happen is that you'll get, again, an advantage. So if they offer 100 and you offer 50, then you're at a strategic advantage again. Over here, they offer a 75 each because they're, of course, getting pretty close. And at this point, got to be thinking too about the value of time, right? The fact that your time has meaning, and sure, you could, argue over a small amount at the very end, but maybe just getting it done is the right move. And speaking of time value of money, let's talk about time is ice cream. Imagine it's a blazing hot day and you just ran a 10K race. There's an ice cream stand at the end of the race with one ice cream cone remaining. The stranger who did not race starts arguing that he should have the ice cream. There's 2 cups you could use for splitting the ice cream, and it's melting quickly. Should you offer to split the ice cream or negotiate for the entire cone? Well, think of this as, again, this is a metaphor for time is money, right? The idea is if you split now, you get 50-50. If you negotiate for the entire cone, maybe you get you get the win, maybe you get the whole cone, but maybe it melted and you got nothing, right? So consider the time value of money. Sometimes it's better to take a suboptimal solution just to get it done, or a 50-50 split just to get it done, because there's getting this off of your plate, so to speak, or thinking about like an investment strategy, be able to think about long term, how long is it going to take you to get that full amount. So the key takeaway here, the golden rule is to hold your position at the beginning. Hopefully the other person will move first. Concessions given too easily have less value. So you want to be a tough negotiator. It pays to be the harder negotiator, but not too hard, because it's that constant walking that line of being hard but not too hard, because you don't want a deadlock. And you also have to consider about the time value of money. If it's not worth it, then don't negotiate as hard. All right, handling difficult negotiations. There are sometimes you're going to end up in a negotiation where things are going to be really, really hard. Most negotiations I do, I negotiate all the time, and I'm sure you do too, in your daily life, in your professional life. And most negotiations go so smoothly, you barely even realize that you negotiated. But every once in a while, you're going to run into a negotiation that's really, really tough, where maybe the other player makes what seem to you to be irrational moves, or they lie, or they disagree with absolutely everything you say, or they exercise their power without seemingly on a whim. A lot of times, this is a case where they have contradictory goals to yours. Your goals are not aligned at all, and they have the power to be able to make your life miserable. So goal contradiction plus power is tough. So here's some examples. Your goal is to complete work, but theirs is to, for example, make you lose, right? So in some political situations, maybe this is what happens. One party wants the other party to lose. The other party's trying to govern or something. Your goal is to complete work. Theirs might be to get you to do all the work, right? So this is free rider. Or it could even be to exert their dominance over you, because what they really want is to show you who's boss. Any of these things could be true. So this example, Slacker, free rides to victory. So we've got Gary and Sam are working on a group project. Gary is an A student. He wants to get the highest grade possible. Slacker. Sam is a C student, and he basically just doesn't want to work. So you might have heard of this term, strategic incompetence. So he uses strategic incompetence. He could work better and more effectively, but he doesn't, because he knows in the end that go-getter's going to do all the work himself. And you might say to yourself, well, this is so unfair. I mean, all of us can think of situations when this has happened. So there's a number of different options that you have if you end up in an unfair negotiation. I'm going to give you 4 different options, that 4 different suggestions of things that you might end up doing to try and break an unfair negotiation. The first one is to change the rules. So go back to negotiating process. And as I mentioned with the styles part, style plus process can often lead to a strategic advantage for you. So think, what is going to give you an advantage? For example, can you create a deadline or an issue or something that actually gives you a favor, that favors you and can give you an advantage to get them to basically stop acting up? So here's some examples of rules. So do you honor informal agreements? And if so, how are you going to enforce that, right? What does a formal agreement even look like? What kind of contracts are there? So for an informal agreement, you might switch those informal agreements to formal agreements if you've got somebody who keeps lying to you, right? Going back to my son now is not like this, but when he was 5, a lot of times when he was younger, he a lot of times he would make an agreement with you. So you'd say, you can have extra TV time if you, for example, clean your room. And if you gave him that extra TV time in advance, then he would just be like, I'm still not going to clean my room. So you had to make sure that he did his thing first, and then he would get the reward. Learn that over hard experience. And in this case, this is an example of setting rules to be able to make sure that the other party followed through. Who's present at the negotiation? Sometimes you can have different people who could then act to help with you with the negotiation, to help it make it go better. I can think of one example where I had a friend who was in a negotiation with a car dealership. They had a formal agreement that they were going to replace the windshield on this car. He bought a used car and had a crack on the windshield, and they were going to replace it. And they had a formal contract that said that they were going to replace that windshield. Instead, they threw a bunch of epoxy on it and made it absolutely impossible to see through. And they kicked him out when he tried to get them to enforce the agreement. So then he asked me to come back with him. And when I went back with him, they got very angry at us. They actually took the contract and ripped it up, and they still kicked us out of the dealership. But the difference this time was that we actually, I had the wherewithal and helped give him the courage to then at that point approach the leadership of the dealership, which is at a different location. And also we wrote to the Better Business Bureau. And we also wrote to the Attorney General. This is in Oklahoma, Attorney General of Oklahoma. We wrote a lot of letters, and he ended up getting his windshield replaced per the contract. And we still had the ripped up contract that we taped back together. So we were able to get that. So sometimes having somebody with you can help you to get through some of these tougher negotiations, if nothing else, as moral support. Having breaks in food could be another example of rules. And sometimes you just got to play hardball. So you might move to a compete or an avoidance style. This is the idea where you basically, if things are breaking down, you say, I'm just not going to go any forward. I'm just not going to play anymore. You purposefully deadlock the negotiation. I have this negotiation card game that I play with the MBA students. And when they play this game, they'll notice that it's only one person can win. And if they don't win, sometimes they'll have somebody at the table who says, if I can't win, I will just not play anymore. And they'll just put their cards down, and then nobody can win. This is an example of playing hardball. Now, I don't recommend doing this if the other party is negotiating in good faith. But if you have a party that's not negotiating in good faith, you should do your best to try and shut it down. Because if they think to themselves, I can take advantage of you, and you let them take advantage of you, then you're training them to continue to take advantage of you, right? So if you play hardball, you're basically, one time of shutting things down might lead to a future of more successful negotiations. You might also use coercive power, for example, taking to court, or at least bringing in some sort of informal or third party into it. But whenever you do this, your goal should be to keep the door open, with the idea of, when you play nice, I will play nice. Speaking of bringing in a third party, you could bring in a mediator or arbitrator before you end up going to court. This could be useful for breaking deadlocks or correcting power imbalances. It's usually cheaper and easier than a court of law, of course. The difference is that arbitrators have the authority to make decisions, so you want to make really, really sure that that person is neutral, because you've relinquished some of your decision-making authority, whereas mediators are advisors, and they don't necessarily have the same level of power. Last thing you could do is you could just stop playing. Sometimes it's best to walk away. Remember, if your plan B is better than what you're getting from the negotiation, then why are you negotiating? Now, if you can't, and sometimes in a tough negotiation, you can't walk away, and you can't correct the imbalance, in that case, then your goal should be to try and build up your power for later. So be looking for other sources or other alternatives for the future, so that you can walk away in the future, so that maybe you can play hardball in the future. So a loss today might eventually lead to a victory for the future. So the key to unfair negotiations is not to do nothing and not to take it, because again, that's going to teach them to keep doing it. If a negotiation is unfair, take action. Figure out how to make it not unfair, particularly for the future. All right, last thing we'll talk about is closing negotiations effectively. So we're going to talk about three things on this: building a golden bridge, team negotiating, and final moments. So I don't love war quotes when negotiating, because negotiation is definitely not war. That said, there's actually a number of quotes from Sun Tzu that actually apply pretty well to negotiating. And one of them is, build your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across. What that means is it means it's a framing issue. So you reframe their retreat basically from their current position, or they're like, we want this. You can tell them, or try and couch it in terms where it seems like they're going to get a win if they go ahead and make a compromise with you. What you're going to do is you give them an out, basically. The war metaphor goes like this: if you are this attacking army, and you're going to attack this group here in the middle — this is a scene from Lord of the Rings, by the way — then if there's no escape for these guys in the middle. So when the attackers attack, they basically have to fight to the death. Sure, the attackers are going to win, but they're going to take a lot more losses. Even though they have more power, they're still going to, because what else are the defenders going to do? They're going to they have no other solution. But if you give them a way to retreat, then they're going to probably take that, or at least a portion of the attackers are going to retreat. You're going to have fewer losses, and that means it's going to be easier for you to get the win. It's the same idea with negotiating. You strategically give them some sort of out to be able to make them see that your solution is somehow a win for them. So give them some sort of a win. This is particularly true when people are negotiating on behalf of others. Negotiators are sometimes negotiating on behalf of another group, right? So they're agents of another group, in which case it means that they have personal interests and organizational interests. The organizational interests, they're trying to find the thing that's the best solution for their organization or their group or their family or whatnot. Personal interests also might be like job security or promotions, looking good in front of the colleagues, not being yelled at or being the butt of a bunch of jokes. So thinking about that personal interest piece, you can use that to your advantage as a negotiator, because if that negotiator has limited authority, what you could do is you could try to help them write their victory speech, basically. Tell them why taking this deal when they walk back to their group, they can sell this deal and say, hey, this was a great win for us. So you try to help them. You spin it in a way where they know how they can sell it to their group. So explain why the deal that you propose is good for their group, and make sure that they're going to feel comfortable going back to their group with that deal. Okay, the last thing that I want to say about closing is that when you close a deal, you should never appear to be completely satisfied, and you should expect them never to appear completely satisfied. The reason why is if you, at the end of your negotiation, you sign the contract, you go, yes, then they're going to think they got a terrible deal, right? Instead, you should, be a little bit hesitant, be a little bit neutral. They might, if you're not completely done, they might come back and ask for more. If nothing else, it's going to affect your future negotiations with that person. Also, in some cases, you should be a little bit careful because there is a trick that a lot of negotiators use where they ask for something at the very last minute. So you're getting ready to sign. You're drawing up the final documents. It's it's 11:59 and the deadline is at 12, and you're finally going to get this thing done. And they're getting at the very end, and they're like, I'll do this if we have one more thing, and they ask for one more concession. Very common. Because you're just like, oh, I just want to get this done, you're very likely to give them that final concession. So it's a good idea to just have that in mind, because in the moment, it's very easy just to give in. I'm like, fine, I'll just give you. If you have already prepared for this and already have a little bit of wiggle room at the very end, it won't feel so bad if you prepare for it. I'm not proposing that you do this. I am just preparing you that some people do this. And this is a pretty common trick. And again, for the same reason why you should appear never completely satisfied, they will also probably, an experienced negotiator will also probably not appear completely satisfied at the end too. So the key takeaway here is be a good winner, but don't lose sight of what it is that you want. Make sure that you get what you want, but be nice about it, and spin it in a way that makes them feel like they're getting what they want while you're actually getting what you want too. Okay, that's all the content that I have for you. I'm going to go through. I see that there's a number of things in the chat. So let me go ahead. Here we go. Oh, so Jeff is pointing out that Rhett and Colleen and the colleagues have a article in AI, which is fantastic. You should definitely check that out. Super interesting. Let's see, has anyone really negotiated unless they've been asked to leave a car dealership? Has anyone ever really negotiated unless they've been asked to leave a car dealership property? That's pretty funny. Yeah. I definitely, I can't believe that they actually kicked us off the lot. They actually, at one point, they called the police on us. Actually, the police actually did arrive, but it was a long story. But we didn't get in trouble, and neither did they actually. Let's see. What is the importance of personality style in negotiations? Okay, so there is a whole lot of things going on in terms of personality styles. There is a lot more that I think needs to be done, for one thing, in terms of research, in terms of looking at how the effectiveness of using particular styles related to your personality and how that comes across. There's a lot of intangibles and a lot of stuff that goes on with the level of negotiating. There's a lot of detail that still needs to be done in this area. There are some studies on this in terms of personality styles. your willingness to ask for concessions and basically to demand things can often lead you to getting more things. You're more willing to ask, things like that. So there is a style, there is a body of research on that, but there's more work is needed. Do you have examples of calibrated questions? Jeff, can you clarify what you mean by calibrated questions?
And I can give Jeff, just raise your hand and I'll give you permission to talk if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, you can you can, it's not letting me do it. Let's see.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now, yeah.
Yeah, Aaron, I don't know if you've read Chris's Voss book, Never Split the Difference. He uses that term quite a bit, and it kind of references when you get to a point, and some of it is hostage negotiations, but he kind of says, how can I do that? Or you pose the question across it. Your party says, I need this, I want this, which seems maybe kind of unrealistic. An example of a calibrated question to use, how can I do that? That's what I'm do you have examples of that might?
Okay, so yeah, so I think that there's two issues that you're talking about. One is the specific example of calibrated questions. Also the larger, bigger picture is the specific techniques that get used, and when those specific techniques actually get used. So in terms of the calibrated questions, okay. So thinking in terms of how you ask questions and how you basically get to yes through trying to get the other person to basically put input in. Again, this would be something that, asking strategic questions is, there is less academic literature on that than we would like to think there is, for how all of this works. I would like to see more studies on how academic literature can use strategic questions more, even when it comes to getting at things like using the spin technique for like implication questions and needs payoff questions and things like that. In terms of the bigger picture of using persuasion techniques, there is a whole lot of literature on using persuasion techniques just as a general, in a general way. There's all kinds of things about matching buying styles to using specific techniques and things like that. There is a lot to dive into there, and we could talk a whole lot about this, right? So there's the Cialdini techniques, there's all kinds of stuff that could be talked about. Rather than going into specific techniques, I think a lot of it has to do with the interplay between what kind of relationship you have. So one of the things that I've observed in the negotiations, and one of the things that I've read a lot about, is that specific dynamics can develop as between between negotiators, and the specific dynamics that develop, different techniques will work in those dynamics, where they might not work very well in another dynamic. So, for example, if you were to use a technique, I don't know, kind of a buy it now kind of technique, like you have to do this right now, that might not work if the person is like very vigilant of the other person using techniques on them. So it kind of depends on the situation. It's very situational. And that again gets into, it's very contextual. Yeah, that's right. All right, here's another one. Sorry, I know I answered that question in a very roundabout way, but there's a lot there to unpack. What if the other side is not sure about what he wants? Can we understand a negotiating tactic? Okay, yes. In terms of not knowing what you want. So for one thing, you should do your best to try and delay negotiating until you know what you want, basically. But if you don't know what your opening position should be, so in other words, what the first thing you should ask for, the answer to that is sometimes you can let the other party like give you an idea of, like, you can let them speak first. But that is very risky because what might happen is if that other person, that allows them to basically set the anchor. And if they set that anchor to their own favor, you could end up getting a really terrible deal. The answer really to that question is go do your research and try to make sure that you know what you want. Okay. Let's see, I think, anybody else have any other questions?
There's just one that in the Q&A, what is the statistically most effective negotiating style and source of negotiating power?
What is the most statistically effective? Okay, so yeah, so the research that's looked into this has shown that it's the answer is it depends. So I'm sorry, but it's contextual. There are a number of good research articles that have looked at various styles. They don't necessarily line up to the ones that I show you. There's actually they're a little bit different than that. The ones that are used in the academic literature than the practitioner literature. But they relatively line up. And I'm trying to remember what the conditions were. I just very recently read one that was looking at this exact thing that you were talking about, and I'm not remembering the moderating condition is what it depended on. So I'd have to go back over and reread that article. But yes, it goes back to it depends.
Well, it is time up. And Aaron, I want to thank you for a very engaging presentation. A lot to think about and go back and, whenever you're doing any negotiation, even a small thing, I think a lot to think about. And so many questions that come to mind. So hopefully, those you've gone back, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And you all have a nice day. And thanks so much for coming for this webinar. And Aaron, thanks so much again for doing this and the significant effort that you put in. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah.